Good evening. Welcome to the Lougheed College Lectures. It's great to see so many of you here tonight. My name is Rhonda Breakrights. I am one of the faculty members at the Peter Lougheed Leadership College and an associate professor in the Department of Human Ecology. It's my pleasure to welcome you here tonight. We are thrilled to have Hayden Taylor speak with us tonight about Indigenous storytelling. As we begin, I would like to acknowledge that we are situated on Treaty 6 territory, traditional lands of First Nations and Métis peoples. I would also like to thank Syncrude for sponsoring this lecture series for us this year and following years. This is our fourth year at the Peter Lougheed Leadership College. We launched our program in August 2015, and it's been very busy since that time. Early on, we decided to open up these lectures, which are actually part of a course called Topics in Leadership. We wanted to open it up to the general public and to the university community in the hope that they would be of interest to a broader audience. So we're thrilled to see all of you here, and we're really grateful for you coming and making this lecture series a success. I just want to ask, how many of you have been to a previous lecture? Excellent. Good, and I know some of you are students, so hopefully you were at all of them this year. Great. And how many are here for the first time? Great, good. Well, we hope that you'll come back again. It's great to see you out. The Peter Lougheed Leadership College is a leadership program for undergraduate students, and at the Lougheed College, we are building a unique, high-quality leadership program. It's unique because it's available to any undergraduate student from across the University of Alberta campus. And the diversity of educational background of our students, we think, is its greatest strength. Students come together in forum groups, and they work together from different disciplinary backgrounds to wrestle through different issues. And this is the key strength of our program. The purpose of this lecture series is to expose students to provocative research and ideas that will challenge their thinking. And the University of Alberta strategic plan is called For the Public Good, and at the PLLC, we are honored to contribute to this institutional vision as we aim to equip students with the skills that they need to lead toward the good society. Because this is our last lecture this term before Christmas, I'd like to acknowledge some of the individuals that make this lecture series and this college work. There's a lot of behind-the-scenes people and not so behind-the-scenes people. First of all, we have our new principal, Dr. Lois Harder. Thank you very much, Lois, for coming. We have our administrative team. We have Brandon Gareb, Andrea Urbina, Shelby McLeod, and Kelly Hobson, who are all here tonight and who do a lot of work to make this lecture series a success. So thank you to all of you. We have our technical team, Angus Finley and Larry Grossfield. They've been doing this for a number of years, and we're grateful to them for keeping the sound going. Thanks to you both. And we have our Director of Instruction, Dr. Christina Stasia. I'm not sure if she's here tonight, but she plays an important role. And we have our teaching fellows. Our teaching fellows are graduate students who work very closely with our undergraduate students in forum groups to give them a high-quality learning experience. And these teaching fellows are Benjamin Denga, Ziana Esmail, Rob Jackson, Yashi Parmar, Mary Pinkoski, and James White. Thank you to all of you. And of course, we have our Lougheed scholars who make this whole endeavor worthwhile. Can you all give a wave? Great. Thank you. So it's a clapping crowd. And finally, we have our volunteers who come and put in a lot of time to, again, make this lecture series work. So thank you to all of you. Just have a couple of announcements and logistics. So this week, like every week, we have the campus food bank here. We invite you to donate an item or to donate online if you would like to do that. For our lecture tonight, it will run until 6:45, and it will start with a lecture followed by a brief Q&A. Following that, the students will reconvene to their classrooms, and we'll see the rest of you next time. We would ask that you do not audio or video record this lecture tonight. It will be available online within a couple of weeks for you to view again if you're interested. And we also ask you to please turn off your cell phones. I would now like to invite James White to come up. James is one of our teaching fellows, and he's going to introduce tonight's speaker. James.
Good evening. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight. Drew Hayden Taylor is an award-winning playwright, journalist, filmmaker, humorist, and novelist. Raised on the Curve Lake First Nation in Ontario, he has spent the past 20 years traveling the world and writing about it from an Indigenous perspective. He has done practically everything from performing stand-up comedy at the Kennedy Center in Washington, D.C., to serving as artistic director for Canada's premier Indigenous theatre company, Native Earth Performing Arts. The author of 31 books, he also wrote and directed Redskins, Trickers, and Puppy Stew, a documentary on Native humor for the National Film Board of Canada. During the past few years, he has served as writer-in-residence at the University of Michigan, the University of Western Ontario, the University of Lüneburg in Germany, Ryerson University, Wilfrid Laurier, and several Canadian theatre companies. He is currently developing a television series for CBC, as well as celebrating the opening of 2 different theatre productions in Ontario. Please join me in welcoming Drew Hayden Taylor.
As we say on my reserve, grazie. Thank you very much for inviting me here. I always love to come out and talk about the wonderful world of Native literature and storytelling. First of all, to give you some background, I'm one of those few animals you will come across called a professional writer. That is to say, I do not have a day job. I do not spend my afternoons saying, "Would you like fries with that?" But as a professional writer, I more or less like to think of myself as a contemporary storyteller. Because in the 21st century, it's one thing to come up with a story, but it's another thing to come up with a way of telling that story. Because there's so many different ways of telling your story in today's modern society. Now, and I have part of the fun of being a contemporary storyteller is exploring all those different ways of telling your story. As you heard, first of all, I've written novels, I've written short stories, I have written plays, I've written documentaries, I've written a graphic novel, a musical, over 1,000 articles, etc., etc., etc. All because when you come up with an idea, there's more than one way to explore that idea, to express the idea, to develop that idea. And I think in today's society, it's a lot more fun to do that. Now, just to give you some background on who I am, where I come from, and where I'm getting my stories from, is I'm from a small reserve in central Ontario, a place called Curve Lake, about 2 hours northeast of Peterborough, near a town called, 2 hours northeast of Toronto, near a town called Peterborough. I was born and raised there, and as with many First Nations writers, a lot of my stories and a lot of my storytelling technique came from that community. I was born and raised there, and I live there now. At the same time, I come from both a big and a small family. I come from a big family because my mother was the oldest of 14, which is what used to happen before they had the internet. So with marriages and stuff like that, I had about 20, 22 aunts and uncles, and about the same number of first cousins. So I had a big family. While at the same time, I come from a small family. I'm a single child of a single parent. And my mother blames that on the fact that when I was born, I was 11 pounds, 12 ounces. Breech. No cesarean. So I like to think I gave my mother both quantity and quality. So I grew up there with my mother in Curve Lake. And the thing about growing up in a small reserve, a small town out in the middle of nowhere, is frequently things can get boring. If you're in the summer, there's only so many times you can go swimming, only so many trees you can climb, only so many times you can go frolicking through the bulrushes. Wintertime, it got even more boring. And we had where I was, we had 2 television stations, and for all the young people here who are not going to get this next reference, ask your teacher. Both of those stations were snowy. So I grew up basically wanting to explore the world. And I have this very, very distinct memory of when I was 5 years old, sitting on the steps of the house I grew up in. I'm sitting there, on my lap, I had a big stack of comic books that my mother had brought me. And I'm sitting there looking at them at the age of 5, and I don't know why I remember this, but I remember thinking, wow, next year I get to go to school and I'll be able to read these. And I did. And for me, comics was my gateway drug to literature. So I read them and I started to read, and I read more and more and more, and I loved reading. I would read these tales from exotic places that somehow landed on the lap of this little kid on a reserve in the middle of nowhere, and they were like passports to new places. So the more I read, the more I wanted to become a writer/storyteller. And the reason being, like, speaking as, decades later as a writer, when you write something, when you write a story, a play, a novel, a short story, whatever, and you create a universe for your characters, right? The universe has to be as three-dimensional, as detailed as the world you lived in. And in that world, you can make your characters do anything you want. You can make them fight, you can make them fall in love, you can make them kill each other, you can create problems, you can create solutions. Basically, you can do anything you want with those characters that you create in that universe you create. And for me, it became obvious to me that I had more control over the universe I could create than the universe I actually lived in. And I liked that. So I decided I wanted to be a writer. But the problem being, I'm very, very old. I was born just after they invented paper. So when I was growing up, as somebody who wanted to be a writer, a native writer on the reserve, there were no other native writers that I knew of, right? This is way before the internet. I just go by the books that we had in schools or whatever, and I didn't know of any native writers around. So I wasn't sure if I could become a writer. So, as is often the case, when you don't know something, you go and seek advice and guidance from those who are wiser and older than you. So, the first person I went to see about this was my grade 11 English teacher. I walked up to him. I distinctly remember this. Walking into the homeroom, he was looking for something in the bottom left-hand drawer of his desk. I walked up to him and I said, "Sir, is it possible to make a living from creative writing?" And without even looking up, he said, "No, not really." And that resonated with me, right? My English teacher, my future career as a writer, telling me that there's not much point in being a writer. So I've always been a firm believer that the best revenge is living a good life. So as the decades went by and I became a writer and I got to tour all over the place, and I spend a lot of time talking with young people. I do a lot of high schools, both on reserve and non-reserve, and just talking with a lot of young people about the world of being a writer. And I always say to these young people, the only thing I can teach you, the only thing worth learning, the only thing when you walk out of this room that you should take with you is never trust your grade 11 English teacher. So again, those words stayed with me. The second person I went to talk with about becoming a writer was my mother. I went up to my mother and I told my mother that I wanted to be a writer. And my mother looked at me with a very perplexed look saying, "Why do you want to be a writer? It's not going to get you anywhere." Again, words that reverberated around in my head for a long time. Why do you want to be a writer? It's not going to get you anywhere. Now, I perfectly understood, or now I do, why my mother said that. My mother had a grade 6 education. Her first language was Anishinaabe, and she had spent most of her life cooking and cleaning in various places and stages for white people. So the idea of being a writer was literally not on her radar. It just, who does that? Especially not Native people, especially not her son. But again, saying the best revenge is living a good life, as the decades went by and I became a writer, always remembering that phrase, why do you want to be a writer? It's not going to get you anywhere. I would travel the world and send my mother postcards from places like India, China, Australia, New Zealand, Fiji, Mexico, Cuba, the Bahamas, England, Finland, Sweden, Holland, Belgium, Germany, the Czech Republic, Austria, France, Italy, and Spain. I would send her a postcard saying, "Look where writing got me." Of course, still being a very loving and gracious son, I would pick my mother up ceramic plates from all these different countries and bring them home. So my mother had the best knick-knack collection of any woman on the reserve. So anyways, I'd wanted to be a writer. I'd wanted to be a contemporary storyteller. But I was told there's not much point in it. There's no, why bother being a writer? There's no future in it. So I made one of the, what I consider one of the worst mistakes of my life. I actually believed them. So I gave up wanting to be a writer. But at this particular moment, right, my late teens, my reserve at that time when I was growing up had about 1,000 people living there. And I told you how big my family was. So it became painfully obvious to me in my late teens that I was related to practically every girl on the reserve. And that's as good a reason as any to go to college. And I've always been surprised why more colleges and universities who are trying to encourage more Aboriginal students to come to college or university never investigate that possibility. So I decided I wanted to go to college. But the problem was to take what? I wanted to be a writer, but the world of writing didn't want me. So what to do? So they gave us these books, and I guess they still do, of universities, colleges, all the programs and stuff. I'm trying to figure out what to take, because I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to become an accountant or any of that kind of stuff. So I decided, I went through it, and I found something. I found something called radio and television, and I thought, hey, I listen to the radio, I watch television. How hard can it be? Now, it was for a course called Radio and Television Broadcasting. It was a journalism course. And on retrospect, it was one of the worst things I could take because, like a lot of Native youth, I was painfully shy. I was horribly shy. In fact, I remember that we had to do, I don't know if they still do it today, but we had to do public speaking in grade 8, speeches. And I hated those. And in fact, one morning in grade 8, when I had to say a speech, I got up. My mother had already gone to work. I got up, and I'm just standing there at like 7 in the morning, trying to figure out what to do. I really did not want to do this. So I came to a decision. Between the living room and the kitchen, there was an archway. And I went up, and I grabbed it, and I whacked my head on the corner about 5 or 6 times until I almost passed out. That's how much I hated public speaking. So that when I stayed home that day, when my mother came home, I said I tripped and hit my head. So the idea, and I realize the irony of me telling you that right now, right here in front of you. So I got out of saying the speech, by the way. I ended up finding a cure for fear of public speaking later on, and because I wouldn't advise this method to just anybody. But anyways, So radio and television broadcasting is journalism. Essentially, it's a career of either going up to people or phoning people that I didn't know and asking them a bunch of questions that were frankly none of my business. Stupidest course I could take, but I took it. I got off the reserve. I got into a town of 5 million people, half of them women, none I was related to. So that was fine. Now, I graduated, but what to do now? I wanted to be a writer, but I was told not to be a writer. So I was trying to figure out, I had to get a job, because I had one of these things called a very hungry landlord that liked to be fed on a regular basis. And I had to find ways of feeding that landlord. But I didn't know what to do. I wanted to be in the arts. If I couldn't be an artist, I wanted to be in the arts. So I was going to be a wannabe, a hanger-on, like I'm with the band type of person. So I ended up getting all these different jobs that were involved in the arts, but not as an artist. I ended up working for the Canadian Native Arts Foundation. I did the sound on a bunch of documentaries on Native culture. I was a trainee producer for CBC Radio. And I ended up getting a job with a film company. Back in the late 80s, there was this film company that was doing a television series based on taking place on a fictional Native community in northwestern Ontario through the eyes of the kids. So it was a children's series. And as was the custom back then, all the writers, all the directors, all the producers, and half of the actors were non-Native. I heard about this series. I managed to get a grant from, I think it was the Department of Indian Affairs, for half a salary. And I knocked on the door and said, "Hi, you're doing a series on Native people. You have nobody working here. I've got half a salary. Hire me." And they did. Only problem being I knew nothing about film production, so I ended up doing all the grunt jobs. I was production assistant, casting assistant, chaperone. But one of the things they gave me to do, and this is all tied into the changing face of contemporary storytelling, is they gave me the scripts to read, to break down, of the half-hour drama. So I would take them, I would break them down, and help plan the actual production. But not only that, they also wanted me, because I was the only Native person in the office, I was the technical advisor, technical consultant for accuracy. So they would give me these scripts to read for technical accuracy. I would read them and they would say, "Is this script technically accurate?" Because you have to keep in mind, this is shot in northwestern Ontario. So as we all know, the Indigenous people in northwestern Ontario are identical to the Native people in southern Ontario. So I would read, they'd say, "Is this technically correct, this script?" And I would say, "Yes, Native people eat toast." So that was basically it, right? I would read these scripts for that, but I learned the structure of television from that. I learned that television, 60% of almost anything anybody wants to write is learning the structure. Whether it's a novel, whether it's plays, television show, or whatever. When you understand the structure of what you're writing, it makes it so much easier to write. And that's one of the things I've learned over all these decades. As you heard, my 31st book just came out, and people say, "How can you pump out so many books like that?" It's because I understand the structure of most forms of writing, and when you dive into it, it makes it a bit easier. So anyways, I started, I was working on a series. It ended. I finished. But my landlord was still hungry. He still wanted to be fed. So I ended up writing this article on adapting Native stories into television film format. Boy, I said that fast. I was talking with all these story producers on all these television shows across Canada at the time. And I was talking with one, and I don't even remember if it was me or her, but one of us suggested I submit a story idea just for the heck of it. I did. They bought it, and I wrote it, and it was produced. And at the age of 25, this is for all the old fogies in the audience. At the age of 25, I wrote an episode of a show called The Beachcombers. As I said, I was 25. I barely knew what I was doing, but I understood the structure of a half-hour television. So I did it. They produced it. And from there, I did a North of 60. I did a Street Legal and a couple of other shows. So basically, I was writing television, which is one of the most highly structured forms of writing you'll come across. And then from there, things got really interesting for myself and for the larger Canadian Native artistic literary community. I personally believe that the contemporary Native literary renaissance began in 1986. November 22nd, 8 p.m. The wind was out of the east, and the Maple Leafs were playing badly. That's when a little play called The Res Sisters premiered in downtown Toronto, 16 Spadina Road. And that single little play, in my opinion, for what it's worth, revolutionized the larger Canadian theatrical and literary community. This little play, which is essentially about 7 Native women wanting to go to the world's largest bingo game in Toronto. That's essentially the plot line. 7 women, 1 male character who's the trickster. During the first week it ran in Toronto, they had to give away free tickets because nobody was coming to see the play. It was by this unknown playwright named Thompson Highway in this bizarre venue called the Native Canadian Centre, and it was about 7 women wanting to play bingo. Why would anybody go and see a play like that? So they were actually standing out in the street giving away free tickets. By the end of the run, it was standing room only. And this is to show the progression of success of that play. 86, it ran. 87, they remounted it and did a national tour of Canada, stopping in all the capitals. 87, it represented Canada at the Edinburgh Fringe Festival in Scotland. And 89, the sequel, Dry Lips Oughta Move to Kapuskasing, came out. 91, this massive tri-company production of Dry Lips Oughta Move to Kapuskasing, which consisted of the Manitoba Theatre Centre, the National Arts Centre in Ottawa, and the Royal Alex in Toronto, produced it. So in theory, I've heard this bandied about, but I have no way that it's true. Supposedly, it was all 3 companies put in $1 million to produce this Native play. So that sort of tells you the explosion of Native theatre out of practically nothing, the Big Bang Theory, the Big Red Bang Theory. Now, what is so interesting about this is it threw the doors open for Native representation, not only on stage, but in all forms of storytelling. For a while, theater became the vehicle of expression for many Native writers, primarily because theater is the next logical progression of oral storytelling. It's taking the audience on a journey using your mind, your body, and your imagination, right? So when I was growing up, I lived right across from my grandparents. And during the summer, you heard how big my family was. During the summer, a couple times a week, they'd have these big bonfires. And I'd have aunts, uncles, cousins come over, sit around the bonfire, and tell funny stories. And I grew up listening to these people tell funny stories. And when it was time for me to go to bed, as I said, I lived right across the road, and we didn't have big, noisy air conditioners. We were lucky if we had mosquito screenings. I would go to sleep still hearing these funny stories being told. So somehow, unconscious, subconscious, whatever, it went into my mind. And then as I grew up, I wanted to tell funny stories that were reminiscent of the stories I grew up hearing. So when theater opened its doors, it became a venue for a lot of Native people who wanted to write, because we all grew up, for the most of us, grew up in an oral storytelling tradition. And that's what theater is. It's oral storytelling, just breaking it down into some different characters. And it became an easier way of telling your story rather than through prose. I mean, you heard me say I have my 31 books out. I think my first novel was book number 17 or 18. I'd done some short stories, a lot of nonfiction, a lot of theater, all different kinds of writing. But I was always afraid of prose. You know, the education I'd had on the reserve and later when we were bused to nearby Lakefield for high school, prose scared me because it's such a technically accurate form of writing. I've had 31 books produced, and to this day, I still do not know what a dingling participle or split infinitive is. And it doesn't matter, I hire white people to know that for me. So, Native people like me grew up hearing stories told, and then with theater, it was roughly the same thing. Going from, as I said, for myself, hearing family and friends sitting around that bonfire, telling stories, using voices. The story has a beginning, a middle, and an end, and often using voices to imitate whoever was telling that story. It was a training ground for theater. And so when I got this opportunity, I was writing television, and just a couple of years after Red Sisters, right? At that time, Thompson Highway, the artistic director of Native Earth, had gotten a grant for a playwright in residency program. And at that time, there were two working Native playwrights in Ontario. Thompson, who was the artistic director, and Daniel David Moses, who was the outgoing writer in residence. So, Thompson was desperate. He had this grant. And I don't know if you know any arts people, but it goes against our nature. If you don't spend the grant, you have to give it back. And that goes against the nature of most artists. So he was desperate, and he did what a lot of desperate people do. He went to the bottom of the barrel, and there I was passed out. And he asked me if I wanted to be the writer in residence, and I said no. Because again, the education I'd had in Curve Lake and later in Lakefield had taught me that at that time, theater was essentially dead white men. I didn't know any dead white men. I didn't speak iambic pentameter. So I said, no, thank you very much. And I always thought theater artists were rather pretentious. And in television, they feed you. So I said no, but Thompson cheated. He said, look at it this way, Drew. You sit through the rehearsal of 2 plays, maybe write a play at the end of it. It's 20 weeks' work. And at the end of every week, you get a big, huge check. And I was still hearing the growling of my hungry landlord. So I said, okay. So I'm one of the few people you'll meet that got into theater for the money. So that literally is my glorious introduction into the world of theater. Didn't care about theater, didn't want to be in theater, but I decided I needed the money. So I became a playwright. So for me, this is like one of the most exciting avenues of how I got involved in this whole thing. The fact that I got involved in theater, and most people would think Native people in theater back then didn't go because you have the proscenium arch, you have the thrust stage and all this sort of stuff. But at its core, you're just telling stories using voices, which is something I grew up knowing, and a lot of Native people grew up knowing. So there was this explosion of exciting Native theater coming from people who otherwise might not have had the opportunity to tell their stories that way. So I got involved with Native Earth, and as I said, I didn't like theater, didn't know anything about theater, but I wanted to learn more about theater. So I started reading plays and going to see stage plays. And this is where, for me, things got really interesting and deconstructing the world of Native storytelling at that time. The vast majority of Native theater, Native stories, Native novels coming out of our community were dark, depressing, bleak, sad, and angry. Almost all the characters being created by Native writers were either oppressed, depressed, or suppressed. And I found this very, very odd. I remember talking with 2 Native women coming out of 2 different plays in 2 different cities. I asked them the same question and I got the same answer. what do you think of the play? And they both said, I think I'm going to stop going to see Native plays. I'm tired of being depressed. And I sort of understood this. There's a saying in the introduction to Thompson Highway's Res Sisters where he says, actually I think he's quoting somebody, where he says, before the healing can take place, the poison must be exposed. And that's what was happening during that first 10, 15 years of Native theater. The poison was being exposed. When an oppressed people get their voice back, chances are they're going to write about being oppressed. So there was a sudden thrust of stories coming out of the Native community from Native artists saying, you know, we've been colonized for several hundred years and it hasn't been fun. And this is why. So there was this understandable series of stories about the problems inherent in being a colonized people. And I remember having discussions with Maori writers from New Zealand, Aboriginal writers from Australia, and Dalit writers from India. Dalits would be known as the Untouchables. And basically, when the common consensus was, when you've been at the bottom of the social hierarchy for hundreds or thousands of years, and you're finally given the opportunity to tell your story, chances are it won't be a comedy. So again, those first 10, 15 years of the contemporary Native literary renaissance basically dealt with the negative aspects of the Aboriginal existence in Canada. And primarily, even to this day, largely to this day, you pick up a Native novel, you go see a Native play, it still, to a lesser extent, deals with those issues. Usually there's three themes. It's either a historical narrative, a victim narrative, or something dealing with the byproducts of what I refer to as post-contact stress disorder. So I was thrust into this, and I remember understanding all this, but then stepping back going, I was raised by my mother. And my mother was by no means oppressed, depressed, or suppressed. I wasn't really seeing her on a lot of these plays because my mother had worked hard all her life, had a wonderful sense of humor, had raised me, but I'm seeing all these, again, victim narratives on stage, and I wasn't seeing my mother, I wasn't seeing my aunts and uncles, and I have been very fortunate to have traveled to over 140 Native communities across Canada and the United States. And everywhere I've been greeted with a laugh, a smile, and a joke. And again, I wasn't seeing this. For me, it's been our sense of humor that has allowed us to survive all those centuries of oppression. But again, wasn't seeing this. A lot of our writers were dealing with the more dysfunctional aspect of the First Nations community. And I remember actually here in Alberta, I was on the Blood Reserve, talking with an elder there about this, and he looked at me and he said that in his opinion for Native people, humor is the WD-40 of healing. And I thought about that. Humor is the WD-40 of healing. That's so cool, that's almost t-shirt worthy. And it made sense. If you look at the earlier saying by Thompson Highway, before the healing can take place, the poison must be exposed, and then deal with the other one. Humor is the WD-40 of healing. So many of these other writers who are far better at this than I was exposing the problems inherent with colonization. I was more interested in dealing with the healing, with the humor, right? Because it's been my belief that, you've heard me say this, it's been our humor that's allowed us to survive so much of the problems in our community. I think it was Leslie Marmon Silko who once said, oftentimes the best way to know a people is through what makes them laugh. So I decided I wanted to, there were enough people writing about the sadder aspects of the Native community. I wanted to celebrate the Native community. I wanted to empower, I wanted to heal. So I decided I wanted to write humor. I wanted to celebrate the Indigenous funny bone. So I wrote my first play, my first comedy, I should say. I write 4 types of plays. I write dramas, which have a lot of humor in them. I write theater for young audiences. I write what I refer to as intellectual satires that have a very specific meaning at the center of the play, but is explored through satire. And then I do comedies, which I used to think were just sheer celebrations of the Indigenous sense of humor with absolutely no socially redeeming qualities whatsoever. But in my ongoing learning experience, there's no such thing as having no socially redeeming qualities whatsoever. Native literature, by definition, anything you do in Native literature is a comment on society. So I wrote a play called The Bootlegger Blues, which is about a 58-year-old good Christian Ojibwe woman who, through a series of circumstances, finds herself in possession of 143 cases of beer that she has to bootleg in order to buy an organ for the church. And it's loosely based on a true story. My mother was so mad when I wrote that play. So, what you need to know about that play is we produced it. It was produced by a Native theater company on Manitoulin Island called the Bajamajig Theater. It toured to Native communities, whatever. And we thought it was a noble experiment doomed to failure and die a horrible death. Because Native theater, by definition, was designed to make the audience uncomfortable. It was designed to push the envelope. It was designed to make the non-Native audience squirm in their seat, feeling guilty. My play, as I said, was not. So it toured, did very well, and then about a year later, I got a phone call from a theater company saying, "We just read your play. We'd like to produce it next summer. Can we?" And this was a non-Native theater company. And my jaw dropped, and first of all, I started thinking about what a great opportunity. I could start making me some of that Caucasian money. So anyway, we worked it all out. We went down there, we went into rehearsal with it, and it opened. Now it was in a place called Port Dover, Ontario, on Lake Erie, a summer theater company, 311 seats. Rehearsal, opening night, I'm there. Full house, 311 seats. Curtain goes up on my comedy. Absolute silence. Nothing. Off in the distance, you can hear coyotes howling. Tumbleweeds went across the stage. They weren't laughing. They weren't laughing at my comedy. And I made sure they put the word comedy on the poster. The director was very, very good. The actors were great. Let's face it, the writing was brilliant. But nobody was writing. And I was getting so nervous. I was sitting in a seat saying goodbye to all that Caucasian money. But now what you need to know is about 20 minutes away from this theater is the largest First Nations community in Canada. A place called Six Nations with over 25,000 Haudenosaunee people. 2 of the actors in the play were Native. We're from Six Nations. So I said there were 311 people in the audience, 300 non-Native, and about 6 to 10 Native people who were brothers, sisters, parents, aunts, uncles of the 2 actors. So when I said there was absolute silence, there was, except for a group of Native people in the balcony in the back who were laughing from the very first moment. And I'm looking over my shoulder at them. They're laughing, nobody else is, right? You got to imagine, it's a sea of primarily white hair. And I'm watching, and the most interesting thing happened. At about 10 minutes into the play, a circle of white people around the Native people started to laugh. I watched a little longer. The next circle of white people around the Native people started to laugh. And so on, and so on, and so on, until about the halfway through the first act, almost everybody in the theater was laughing. It was like throwing a rock in a pond and watching the circles get bigger and bigger and bigger. And it occurred to me what had been happening, because I told you the vast majority of Native plays that most people were familiar with were dark and angry. And so they'd come to this play about Native people and beer, expecting to feel guilty. Instead, they got this comedy, and they didn't know what to do until they saw the Native people laughing, and they realized they could laugh. They were waiting for permission to laugh, and they got it, and they started laughing and laughing and laughing. The show did very, very well, and I had 4 or 5 other ones there. So it was sort of like, it was the most interesting sociological experience I'd ever seen, watching this whole thing. The second play I did, second comedy I did, was called The Baby Blues. How many people here have been to a powwow? Okay, good. So most people at least know what they are. So this is a story about an aging powwow dancer, a fancy dancer, but he's getting too old to win anymore. But he's holding on. He basically goes from competition powwow to competition powwow, earning enough to get him to the next powwow. And but he's getting too old, and he comes to this one reserve that he hasn't been to in a very long time. He's like, you know, he party, chasing. He's into 3 things: dancing, partying, chasing women, all that sort of stuff. And he comes to this reserve that he hasn't been to in a very long time for the powwow. He's setting up his tent. He sees a beautiful young girl down by the water. He goes down, starts to sweet talk her, and through the conversation, both we and he discover it's his long-lost daughter from his last trip there 18 years ago. Don't you hate it when that happens? He tries to get away, but he runs into the mother, who sabotages his truck and won't let him leave until, in that weekend, he can come up with 17 years back child support. Again, don't you hate it when that happens? So that's basically the story. So it was produced a bunch of places. It was a very successful comedy. And then I got another phone call. And I mean, this is back in the days when people actually called people. So I got the phone call saying, "We love your play and we'd like to produce it next season." I said, "Cool, great, wonderful, send me the check." And he says, "No, you're going to have to help us translate it first." And I'm going, "Translate it? Where are you calling from?" And he says, "Oh, I'm sorry, we're phoning from the University of Venice, Italy." And I went, "Venice, Italy? That's the place with water for streets, right?" And he goes, "Yes." And I'm thinking, and I said to him, "Why does the University of Venice want to produce my play?" Because again, I'm thinking about it. It's about this aging Lothario here for a good time, not a long time. Knocks up a woman. He's just your party. Let's do this. Let's have lots and lots of fun. And I said, why do you want to produce this? And he says, "I think it's something Italians can relate to." So I said, "Okay." So we ended up translating it into Italian. They ended up producing it. I didn't make it there to Venice for the production. I got there later. But they sent me this ancient piece of technology some of you may remember called a videotape. And I watched it, and it was one of the most surreal things I have ever seen. First of all, it's a powwow play, and I don't know if there are any Italians here, if I'm pronouncing this correctly. It's a powwow play in a teatro, a theater. It's a powwow set designed by Italian set designers who've never been to Canada, let alone a powwow. The powwow costumes are by Italian costume designers who've never been to a powwow, let alone a First Nations community. All the actors were Italian actors who'd never been to Canada, a First Nations, or a powwow, all running back and forth across the stage going, "Il powwow." So anyways, and I've done a whole bunch of other plays and such like that. But what is so interesting about, again, the title of this, The Changing Face of Storytelling, is the fact that you heard me mention the 3 characteristics of the stories that were coming out of the First Nations community. But what is so interesting nowadays is the fact that we are now beginning to explore the concept of of not just theater, but I'm sure there are movies, television series. Right now, I'm developing a television series for CBC. They commissioned me to write a television series for them. And it's one of these things where, oh, God, do I have to? Because they want a procedural. If you know what a procedural is, it's a cop show, a lawyer show, a doctor show. It's where, these professionals have a problem, they solve it by the end, and everybody lives happily ever after. And how many cop shows have we all seen? And they wanted a native cop show. And I'm sort of going, oh, okay. But I decided to make it different. And for all the older people in the audience, I decided to do a more contemporary Canadian version of a series from the 90s called Northern Exposure. So one of the things I like doing battle with is the perception that all Native people are alike, right? And it's sort of like somebody and I'm very conscious of the fact that I'm standing up here with you with bluish green eyes and all that. My standard joke for the last 20 years has been, I'm half Ojibwe, half Caucasian, so technically that makes me an occasion. Or as I like to say, a special occasion, if not a memorable occasion. So, in 1497, when John Cabot landed on the East Coast, at time of contact, it's estimated that there were over 50 separate languages and dialects spoken in Canada. Now, when you think about it, that's like discovering Europe, right? Over 50 separate languages and dialects spoken in Europe. So, yet here, many people think the Cree are similar to the Mi'kmaq or similar to the Salish, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that's like saying the Italians are identical to the Belgians or identical to the Danes who are identical to the Portuguese, et cetera, et cetera. So what I was trying to do with this particular play is to show that difference. So my television series is about a Mohawk cop transferred to an Ojibwe reserve in Northern Ontario. Now, while many of you might not think, yeah, so, trust me, there's a lot that can happen. Culturally, etc. That's sort of what I'm doing on, and I've been and all the fun stuff that I come up with, again, based loosely, some of it loosely. For instance, one of the episodes I've got, this principal is going to send some kids off to an island as part of a sentencing circle, but the kids don't want to go, so they decide to sabotage the principal as the principal's going underneath an overpass. They throw a dead moose on his car. So he thinks he hit a moose and goes in, but they miscalculate and he almost gets killed or anything, but it's like, assault by moose. And another story that's based on a true story, the cops get a call about there's been a robbery at a cottage on the reserve. So they show up and they misunderstood it. What's happened is somebody's come and stolen the entire cottage. Because it's one of these A-frame, all put together. Basically, a barge has come up on shore with a winch, wrap it off, put it on the barge, go off, and it's based on a true story. So I'm having all sorts of fun with that. But again, that changing face of storytelling. When I worked on that television show 30 years ago, I was the only Native person there other than some of the actors. And now, we are going, much like the way North of 60 was, this is Native inspired, Native themed, and it's going to be primarily Native focused. And again, Native people telling their stories, going from telling stories around that bonfire to telling stories around that stage, the screen, and the page. Now, what is even more exciting now is our writers are beginning to embrace the world of genre fiction, which is so exciting. Tom King, who I'm sure many of you know, when he's not writing award-winning fiction or nonfiction, his hobby is writing murder mysteries. A friend of mine, Cataract-Windsey Dam, she edited and compiled a book of international Indigenous erotica, which we like to call 50 Shades of Red. Daniel Heath Justice has sort of a Cherokee Native version of a trilogy of Lord of the Rings with elves and stuff like that. So it's become really, really interesting. My very first novel, as I said, I was not interested in writing novels up until, again, I got another one of those phone calls saying, can we take you out to lunch? One of the things, if anybody here is an up-and-coming writer, never turn down a free lunch. I was taken to lunch, and they basically said they've been following my career, and they think I have a novel in me. Now, I disagreed. I'd written a couple of short stories, but novels scared me because I didn't know if I could have a novel that long. And I'm sure many of you know many unsuccessful novelists who they spend a year to 10 years working on a novel, try to get it sold. They're turned down by a bunch of different publishing houses. They put it in their bottom drawer, forget about it, and become an alcoholic. That didn't appeal to me. So I never wanted to be a novelist. But then, again, these people cheated. They said, we'll commission you, we'll pay you in advance. And that was cheating. So I said, okay, I'll do this. I was so excited. I contacted my agent. We hammered it out, signed the contract. And for 30 minutes, I was ecstatically happy. I thought, I'm going to be doing a novel. I'm going to be like a grown-up writer. And then the slow realization began to creep into my consciousness of what I had signed a legal document to deliver. I had agreed to deliver on a predetermined date a manuscript consisting of no less than, and hopefully more than, 50,000 words. I was fairly sure I did not know 50,000 words. Most of the short stories I'd done, the longest one had been 3,000 words. So it's like, metaphorically speaking, it's like climbing a 50,000-foot mountain, having only climbed 3,000 feet. And I was terrified. And I went home. Sorry, I'm carrying on here. I'm running out of time here. Basically, that novel was a native vampire novel. It's called The Night Wanderer. And people had said, nobody's ever done a native vampire novel. Well, they have now. My second book, Motorcycles and Sweetgrass, has been described as magic realism. My most recent collection of short stories are native-themed science fiction short stories called Take Us to Your Chief. Sherry Demerlane has the best-selling YA novel out there called The Marrow Thieves, which is a dystopian sci-fi. Wabagijik Rice has a book, something of the crusted snow, Moon of the Crusted Snow, which again is a dystopian sci-fi novel. So now we're learning to tell our stories by embracing other genres. Because I knew that our writers were just as interested, just as talented, and just as curious to explore the world of genre fiction. There was a musical last couple of years touring Canada about residential schools. It was a musical called Children of God. So just never know what's going to pop out of the Native community next. I was asked if I wanted to adapt and indigenize a Bertolt Brecht Kurt Weill musical. And I said, sure, cool, wonderful. Who are they? And once I learned who they were, I said, yeah, I can do this. And we did it. So what you might know, what you might perceive, what you might have been taught about traditional Native storytelling or literature is ancient. What is happening now is exciting, it's new, and you just never know. I saw at one of the Imaginative Film Festival recently, Indigenous virtual reality. Sitting there with those goggles on, looking around. You look absolutely goofy, but it's just absolutely amazing what is coming together in the First Nations community now. That is the changing face of Native storytelling in the 21st century. Thank you.
Thank you, Drew. So we're going to have a few minutes for questions. If you have a question, I think, do we have the ball? Oh, mics. We have mics. Excellent. Okay. So we have our Vanna Whites here that are going to assist. And
Vanna
if you can just
Reds.
keep your questions as brief as possible to allow for as many, that'd be great. There's one right up here. Oh, sorry.
I'm not too sure if I was the one that was supposed to get this or not, but I do. Fascinating and enjoyable talk. I'm just wondering if what you've told us about your transition from not being a writer in high school to obviously being a successful writer now, and talking about the genre writing that is going on, whether you're perhaps saying that native writers will be dropping the adjective.
Dropping the adjective? Is that one of those writing rules that says never use an adjective?
No, what I'm saying is that they are changing from being native writers to being
writers who are native.
Who happen to be native or happen to be anything else, and if the transition is occurring.
I think that is true. One of the questions I usually get asked at events like this is, have you ever written anything that was non-native? And it's like, no, I have not as of yet. Basically, as I said, we've been telling our stories for about the last 35 years, whereas the dominant culture had been writing stories for like 2,000-3,000 years. So like we're just playing catch up right now. And yes, my dream is to write a Star Trek episode, which may or may not have a native character in it. I was once actually hired. There was a friend of mine was doing a television series called Always a Bridesmaid, and it was about a low rent wedding planning service where you would come in, you hire these people to plan your wedding for you, and they do theme weddings. That's their forte. And they were working on, so every show was a theme wedding with the underlying relationships between everybody who worked there. And they were going to do an episode on somebody wanted a Star Trek wedding, and they were trying to come up with somebody who can we get to write this, who can write television and knows Star Trek. And they thought, Drew. So I got to write an episode of it that had no native characters in it whatsoever. But unfortunately, the series went belly up, third episode in, and never got made. So I think so. I think that time is coming, because there's just, like, for instance, Daniel Heath Justice's, I think it's I forget the name of it, but it's the one of the Lord of the Rings. They're elves. But a lot of his Cherokee teachings are filtered through the storytelling within what he's trying to say. They're not Cherokee characters. They're elves and dealing with magic and issues that are pertinent in contemporary Indigenous and non-Indigenous society. But he's using characters from fantasy to do it. One of the reasons I like working in science fiction is the fact that science fiction, like any form of literature, science fiction is often thought of as the bastard son or bastard cousin of literature. But science fiction, like other forms of literature, it explores the human experience. It just uses different tools. And when you're doing science fiction, you can explore the same issues in the First Nations community on different planets and different dimensions, etc., without actually having to use native people or non-native people or anything. So yes, I think that is on the horizon.
Thank you so much for your lecture. I really enjoyed it, and I think
I do weddings and bar mitzvahs.
All right, fantastic. I think that a lot of non-Indigenous folks are very like they get all in themselves, the same way you were talking about the Caucasian audience. And one of the ways that you express yourself is through humor, and humor brings life, and it's healing, and it kind of recovers the trauma. But you've also written some really dark chapters, like, for example, even in Motorcycle and Sweetgrass, where you're dealing with the alcoholic trauma, you're on the floor, you're stumbling around, and you have no idea what this person is going through if you've not been anywhere near that. But if you've been near that, you know exactly what they're going through. And so I wondered if you could just kind of explain a little bit more about like how humor is used for healing, and maybe some of the more difficult things that you've seen happen to Indigenous communities and how you have been able to use that as an inspiration to write.
Well, I've had long conversations with Tom King. We've had many a cup of tea, or he has a brand new cappuccino maker that he just loves making cappuccino, where we've talked about humor. And as he says, if you're standing on a street corner and you're screaming out to the audience all the social ills of the world, people aren't going to listen. They'll make stop and roll their eyes and walk on and forget you instantly. But I and he are firm believers that you can teach as much through humor as you can through anything else. So if you take those same social issues, wrap them in humor, and then relay them to the public, they'll stop, they'll listen, they'll laugh, and when they leave, they'll take that message with them, and they may even invite you back with them too. So given a choice of making somebody angry, making somebody cry, or making somebody laugh, I'll choose to make them laugh because I know that I can teach as much through humor as I can through anything else. And that's what I try and do. And it's fun. It's fun writing humor. Of course, the problem is, what did I say once? Bad drama is boring and annoying. Bad comedy is painful. Right? So even though you're writing comedy, you have to be very aware of what you're writing and how you're doing it. As for your other question about things I've seen and how I deal with it, I can't answer that because when I write some of this stuff, it's got to come out of the moment, out of the situation. Sometimes you can pre-plan it. Other times it's very spontaneous. And I don't really have an answer for your second half of your question. I'm sorry, I failed you.
Mr. Taylor, your success came after you left the reserve. Do you think there's any future for Native people who stay on the reserves?
Oh, hell yeah. I live on a reserve now. I went back, yes, as a success. I think so. I know several people on my reserve who are very successful with businesses on the reserve. I know a lot of people on Six Nations has a lot of their writers and actors who live there. I just wanted to get out and see the world. I think everybody does. I saw it, and I moved back about 15 years ago. And I think the world, especially in this day and age with the internet and emails and the whole electronic world, you can get published, you can do anything you want without ever leaving your house, let alone the reserve. So yes, I do believe that you can be just as successful in the reserve as you can off the reserve, especially in today's day and age.
Okay, question.
You were talking about Leslie Marmont Silko, and I don't know if you know Joanne Archibald.
No.
They are more historical, traditional storytellers, and I just wonder if you've ever thought of going in that direction, right? As opposed to.
I spent some time with a woman named Esther Jocko, who's a traditional storyteller on Birch Island, up just north of Manitoulin Island. And I remember we were having this conversation, and she said, because I asked her that question, and she said, we need new stories as much as we need the old stories. If your path is telling new stories, just make sure they have the same resonance as the old stories. And that works for me. And as I said about other type of writers, there are traditional storytellers that are much better at that than I am. And I don't deserve to give it an effort when I know they're out there.
Other questions? Over here.
Thank you again. I'm intrigued by the adaptation of your play for an Italian audience, and very intrigued by the stint that you did in Germany at the Universität Lüneburg as a writer in residence. And I wondered if you could share a little bit with us about what, in your experience anyway, audiences around the world see or experience in your work. What you hear from them when they reach out to you to come into their communities and create and be a part of them.
Germans are weird. About a week ago, I got back from my 18th lecture tour of Germany. They keep bringing me over to talk about Native literature, Native humor, Native theater, Native culture, all these different things. And of course, the big irony being I look more German than Native. But Germans have a peculiar interest in North American Aboriginal culture that goes back to the 1880s when a German writer named Karl May wrote a series of westerns about an Apache warrior named Winnetou and his faithful white sidekick, Old Shatterhand. And basically, they have, the last 6 generations, they have just sort of embraced Native culture. So much so, as I said, I've been over there 18 times. Last year, I went with a film crew and I did a documentary on this called Searching for Winnetou, and it aired twice on CBC Docs. And it was just the most amazing thing. I went to a German powwow. I went to see a play based on, this is so weird because as a theater professional, I went to see a play based on the writings of Karl May in an abandoned quarry. So it's like a huge, huge set, about twice as big as here. It seats 7,000 people. In a summer, 3 months from June to the middle of September, they'll have 300,000 people come to see the play. It's got a cast of about 40 people, 15 horses, a trained bald eagle, and it's just so amazing to see this bizarre fascination with Native people. Now, the big problem being this fascination, having been to a powwow and all that sort of, their powwow, their fascination is with 1880s Native people. They wander around at these things dressed as 1880s Native people. Unless they're at the powwow, then their costumes are just absolutely indistinguishable from Canadian and American powwow dancers. So when I go out and lecture, I usually talk to the students at universities. So basically, those under 40 know the real story, because in Germany, they have a really well-run Canadian studies program. As I said, I keep going over there and lecturing, but usually the people who've read the Karl May, watched the movies, etc., they're sort of still embracing the world of the faux Indian. I got an email from somebody who saw my documentary who said that he was in the army, he was stationed over there, and when the people in his town heard that a Canadian Indian was coming to stay in their town, they were all excited. They went to see him, and then they were promptly disappointed because he was in the army. He had short hair. And real Native people do not have short hair. And do I have time for a quick story about that?
Sure.
Okay, quick story about, I can do a half hour on Germany alone. But when we were doing this documentary, one of the people we interviewed is this German woman who speaks no English, but she has a company. Her job, her company, what she does for a living is she makes teepees for the European market. You just send her how much square footage you want. She has these canvas cutters, all that. She will make you a handmade teepee in however long it takes. And if you want, she'll send you the teepee poles too. She advises against that because sometimes it's difficult to get wood across borders. She says you should get them yourself, but she will do that. Because the thing is, while Germany is ground zero for this fascination, France, Poland, all these other countries also have this shared interest. And here's something. We have had a bunch of people who have been to the powwow. Do we have any powwow dancers here? No? Okay. This is really weird. I'm hoping you'll understand this. As you know, you go to a powwow, and I'm assuming it's the same here. I don't know if I've ever been to a powwow in Alberta. But, there's competition and there's traditional powwows. And in terms of the competition powwows, there's 3 types of male dancing. You got your traditional, you've got your grass, and you've got your fancy dance. With women, it's traditional, jingle, and shawl. Now, they have powwows in Germany, as you heard me say, with German dancers in absolutely 100% perfect regalia. So she was a traditional dancer, and she saw a man dancing grass. And she really liked watching grass dancers. She thought their movements, their costumes, their outfits was just beautiful. And she became infatuated with grass dancing. And she wanted to be a grass dancer. Problem being, only men grass dance. So she was confused. She went to an elder to ask advice. And I'm fairly sure it was a German elder. And said, "What should I do?" And the elder told her, "You have to dance according to what your heart tells you." So she became a female grass dancer in Germany. Now, this is how things are in Europe. She started going around dancing grass. But as with any belief structure whatsoever, there are hierarchies of, I don't know what's the term I'm looking for, fidelity of accuracy, of honoring, whatever. What I'm trying to say is, she was barred from powwows in the Czech Republic and Poland because they don't allow women to dance grass. So this is Poland and the Czech Republic refusing to let her in because we don't like that kind of dancing. They have to be really traditional. So again, the Germans. Das ist gut, sehr gut.
Okay, we are out of time. But hold your questions. Maybe you can run up here and ask them. I'm just cognizant that people may need to go. So we're going to wrap this up now. Thank you very much, Drew Hayden Taylor. Don't forget to buy one of his books because he wants to pay his landlord, his hungry landlord. And our next lecture is on January 28th, Marcia Nelson talking about mobilizing others to act. So hope to see you there. Thank you.